Yes, we can estimate the value of a startup idea in dollars. The key is applying behavioral economics and psychology to derive a signal from customer discovery interviews. The biggest difference between early-stage startups and public companies is how easily we can value companies like Google, as opposed to how hard it is to recognize a good startup idea, especially when the startup has no customers. In this episode, we're going to take a huge step towards bridging that gap. So, how do we value public companies? And if we wanted to do something similar for a startup with no customers, how would that even work? Companies listed on a stock exchange publish their performance every year, and that is part of what drives their valuations. For instance, last year in 2025, Google said that they made $130 billion in profit at a 30% growth rate, which caused the stock market to value Google at a $4 trillion market capitalization. By contrast, Spirit Airlines had a negative profit of $2 billion, and the market valued them at just $50 million. The thing that I find most compelling about market cap valuations is that they are based on first-hand data. These valuations tie back to real money that actual customers paid these companies. This high-quality data makes it relatively easy to value public companies. As a founder of a startup with no customers, you are probably hoping for a billion-dollar valuation someday. But how much is your idea worth right now? Today, a common technique to value a startup idea is estimating the market size and running a back-of-the-envelope projection. When a founder tells me that they assumed their startup would get 1% of a market, it's an exercise in garbage in, garbage out. There is no first-hand data. It is all just speculation. I think that the best way for founders to value their startup idea is by running discovery interviews, because at least that generates first-hand data. But the only metric that I've seen come out of those interviews is a count, as in a founder saying that they interviewed 100 people. Counts are action-based metrics that say nothing about accomplishment. The difference between action and accomplishment is huge. Just because you walked 100 steps does not mean that you are any closer to your destination. You could have just walked in a circle. Likewise, just because you ran 100 interviews does not mean that you created any useful knowledge or found a good reason to invest more time in your startup idea. This confusion drives the most common outcome in entrepreneurship, that a founder wastes a year before recognizing that they are pursuing a startup that will not get lots of customers. What founders desperately need, but have never had, is a way to value a startup idea in dollars, similar to how market capitalization puts a value on public companies. Founders need a way to distinguish 10-cent ideas from $10 million ideas. So today, in this episode, we'll talk about how to extract a dollar-based signal from discovery interviews. These values don't have to be perfect. As long as they're in the ballpark, they'll allow us to make better decisions faster, to evaluate startup ideas in days, not years. The good news is that we can leverage existing toolkits from behavioral economics and psychology. Our goal with converting conversations to dollars is to ultimately generate an ERNIE value for your startup, where ERNIE is spelled E-R-N-Y and stands for the estimated revenue next year from the ground up with no customers today, calculated only using discovery interviews. What market capitalization does for valuing public companies, the ERNIE value will do for startups with no customers. Founders can avoid wasting time on 10-cent ideas that are doomed to fail and get closer to creating the next billion-dollar unicorn. Welcome to the Nascent podcast. I'm Mike Vladimir. Startups with customers face different challenges than startups with no customers. But conventional strategies don't make this distinction. There's no playbook A for startups with customers and playbook B for startups with no customers. So founders struggle because they don't have the right tools. That is why I created Nascent as the strategic toolkit for startups with no customers. This is episode 32. Yes, we can value startup ideas in dollars. Behavioral economics and psychology are the key. Previously, in episode 31, we explored the concepts that money is a metric for pain and every product is a pain relief device. We used the Yardstick of Pain to categorize interviewees as either hurting, fine, or joyous. In this episode, we'll turn those emotional signals into dollars. Specifically, we'll use behavioral economics and psychology to explain why people decide to pay money for products and how much they might pay. So let's talk about how the Yardstick of Pain incorporates concepts from behavioral economics, specifically prospect theory, status quo bias, and loss aversion. These concepts have a major effect on whether a person in pain decides to become your customer. Over the past few episodes, I've mentioned the book Thinking Fast and Slow by the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman because it explains so well why people make decisions. Crucially for me, it isn't just theoretical. Kahneman comes with first-hand data. His book includes prospect theory, which shows how people make decisions under risk. Prospect theory includes a value function graph that explains why people act differently in response to perceived gains and losses. In other words, your startup is going to offer a product to people in pain, and we can predict their behavior based on whether they perceive the product as providing a gain or a loss. For the audience listening, I've included the graph in the Nascent Miro board. You can see the details in the show notes. Here is how Kahneman describes the value function. Quote, "The graph has two distinct parts, to the right and to the left of a neutral reference point. The curve is S-shaped, which represents diminishing sensitivity for both gains and losses. The response to losses is stronger than the response to corresponding gains. To summarize, people on the right of the graph anticipate gains, whereas people on the left perceive losses. People in the middle are neutral. From the perspective of Nascent, the value function maps directly to the Yardstick of Pain. People who are doing fine, or even worse, people who feel joyous, will not become customers because they experience status quo bias and loss aversion. You can talk about gains all you want, but they don't perceive gains to be very valuable. To quote Kahneman, for these people, the disadvantages of a change loom larger than its advantages, inducing a bias that favors the status quo. As a founder, you want to solve problems for people who are actually open to solutions. But people who feel fine or joyous believe that they have a good thing and they don't want to lose it. To be clear, this is how most people feel about most things most of the time. This is the normal state of humanity. In other words, people with status quo bias who are averse to loss will never become your startup's first customers. By contrast, people on the left of the graph, people who are hurting, are experiencing loss and might become customers. Of course, not every person who is hurting will become a customer. A lot more things have to happen to get a person in pain to decide to make a purchase. But for these people, at least there's a chance. In an interview, a person in pain who is hurting might say something like, "Oh, I hate this problem. What do I have to lose? Anything is better than this." From the perspective of behavioral economics, only these people with negative emotional resonance might be open to taking a gamble on getting pain relief from your product. Another way to think about this is through the lens of drive reduction theory from the field of psychology. Drive reduction theory says that when someone is hurting, when they have negative feelings like hunger or thirst, their body experiences a drive to take action and reduce that uncomfortable feeling. Hunger drives us to eat food. Thirst makes us want to drink water. Feelings drive actions because humans seek pain relief. I'm sure that you know this intuitively. This example of a thirsty person drinking is actually called a primary drive because it's innate and reactive. It's an immediate action in response to a really uncomfortable, visceral feeling. But human beings aren't purely reactive. We think ahead. We imagine scenarios in the future, and that generates emotions, which also drive us to act. These secondary drives are acquired and predictive. So, for instance, yesterday you might have been thirsty, which made you look for water. That was a primary drive. Now, today you have a secondary drive, anxiety. You are projecting out a story that you might be thirsty again, and that fear of discomfort is what makes you carry a water bottle around with you all day long. What's interesting about a secondary drive is that it doesn't just come from a personal direct experience. We don't just worry about repeating our own painful ordeals. A secondary drive can also come from an indirect experience, other people's stories. So if somebody tells us about an awful incident, that can also cause us anxiety, which drives our actions. Here is what drive reduction theory means for startups. You are a founder searching for people in pain who might become your first customers, so you want to look for certain primary and secondary drives. When you run discovery interviews and ask people about their previous experiences, You are hoping to hear stories where their primary drives were activated, where something really awful happened to them and they felt miserable. Even better, you're hoping that they now have a secondary drive that comes out of their firsthand experience. You are hoping to find people who feel really anxious or worried or fearful about that awful thing happening to them again. They have a secondary drive to avoid repeating that horrible event. The worse they feel, the bigger your opportunity to create a business. So, for example, if you're a founder of a water bottle startup, you would love to find somebody who was dying of thirst yesterday and is now in a frantic panic to avoid that discomfort again. That is the kind of person in pain who might become a customer. Understanding secondary drives also helps us understand what we want to avoid. Yes, we can try to tell stories and induce a secondary drive in other people, but that is too much work. We don't want to try to convince people that they need to anticipate a problem. We don't want to be storytellers trying to manufacture a secondary drive. Technically, this is possible, but a startup is likely to fail if the plan for customer acquisition is to start with people who feel fine and then try to convince them that actually they should be hurting. That is not a way to build a startup with a good chance of success. To map this back to the yardstick of pain, we are searching for people in pain who are hurting with a secondary drive based on their personal, direct experience. So let's integrate these ideas from psychology and behavioral economics to monetize pain in discovery interviews. Nascent offers founders a 3-step process. As a founder, you want to look at a conversation with an interviewee and characterize emotions as either hurting, fine, or joyous. Please see episodes 27 and 28 for details. Then your next step is to convert emotions to a dollar-based signal. This is the focus of today's episode. Our goal here is just to get an initial signal. Then, step 3 is to measure effort in dollars. In future episodes, we'll go from this rough initial signal to a specific dollar-based measurement. Here is how we map the signal from emotions to dollars. If a person in pain is hurting, we're going to hypersimplify and say that they have $1 of pain. If they're fine, then they've got $0 of pain. And if they're joyous, they have negative $1 of pain. Previously, in episode 31, we talked about how a product moves a person in pain along the yardstick to take them from their current pain at an origin to a better emotional state. The reason I think that this dollar mapping works is because it reflects the journey of a person in pain. Their destination is to feel fine. We are trying to determine their origin, where they're at right now. So a person who is already fine has $0 of pain because they have nowhere to go. They're already at the end of their journey. They have no need for pain relief, no need for a product. In other words, how much might they pay your startup? $0. Even worse is a person who feels joyous. This person needs to go backwards to get to fine. Your product would provide them with negative pain relief. It would take away their joy. So if you want them as customers, you are going to have to pay them. How much might you have to pay them? Let's just simplify and call it negative $1. And then there are people who are hurting. Special people with meaningful pain who have the potential to go on that journey from hurting to fine. They might pay some amount of money to feel better. They present an opportunity for your startup to deliver pain relief. In other words, they might pay for your product. Maybe that's 10 cents, maybe that's $10 million. At this point, I don't want to worry about the exact amount of money that they would pay. For now, let's just focus on the positive signal. So we're simplifying and calling it $1 of pain. The benefit of this mapping of $1, $0, and negative $1 is that it enables founders to make better decisions faster. By monetizing emotions, we can more clearly identify who will pay our startup and why. People with $1 of pain might become customers, but people with $0 or negative $1 of pain are valuable counterexamples of who will not become customers. The big takeaway from this episode is that behavioral economics and psychology allow us to cleanly put a dollar value on many customer discovery interviews. Most of the time, our conversations will reveal people who are fine. Because of loss aversion and status quo bias, those people will not be our first customers. their pain is worth $0. People who are fine are not anxious to avoid an awful outcome. Drive reduction theory does not apply to them. In other words, when we asked, how big is the problem that our startup could solve? Is it worth 10 cents or $10 million? At least for these people, the answer is 0. Their problems are worth $0. If all of the people that you interview have $0 of pain, then the value of your startup idea, at least based on your firsthand data, is $0. Today, founders disregard and overlook interviewees who are fine or joyous. I think that's a huge waste. There's tremendous utility in assigning null values and understanding why those values were null. It's natural for founders to focus on finding customers. However, Nascent takes a more holistic perspective that identifying people who will not become customers also allows us to create valuable knowledge and make progress in vetting our startup idea. Across the last few episodes, I've been asking you to record discovery interviews. I said that you should categorize the pain of the interviewees as either hurting, fine, or joyous. This episode details your next step: map their emotions to dollars. I would love to hear about your experience applying Nascent to analyzing your discovery interviews. If you're navigating a startup with no customers and you want a structured way to approach this challenge, subscribe to this podcast and the complimentary Substack newsletter. If you know of another founder who wants to know the value of their startup idea, share this episode with them. And if you have a funded startup that's pivoting and you don't want to waste another year on a bad idea, let's talk. You can book a call with me at nascentidea.com. I always welcome feedback via email. My address is podcast@nascentidea.com, or you can tweet me at nascentidea. If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and leave a rating or a review. For more episodes, go to YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. Follow me on X @nascentidea and visit nascentstartups.com for the Substack. Links in the show notes. This episode talked about converting emotions to dollars as an initial signal. In the coming episodes, we'll use these values in a data visualization called a quantified pain graph. Ultimately, we'll calculate an earning value, the estimated revenue next year for your startup. Okay, founders, let's find opportunities worth pursuing. You got this.